So I think that the challenge those students face and the university faces is different than it's been in the past. And I don't think we figured out exactly how to do this. I know that deans of students across the university and across the nation are trying to think about how you deal with a group of students who are less able, less prepared, less comfortable dealing with ideas and speech that they find offensive than their predecessors were. But I think the challenge for the university is not to shield them, it's to teach them how to be effective citizens. Because in the real world, you're not protected from that. And if a student doesn't learn how to do that in college, they're going to be in big trouble when they graduate.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I think that we've circled around a little bit to the premise of the question, which is that these students need to be prepared. And it's still my question, how do we prepare them?
Well, as I said, I think that's something that universities are now trying to figure out. This is, in fact, it's a pretty new phenomenon. And I think that deans of students across institutions are trying to figure out how to create programs and sessions that enable students to feel more comfortable, both dealing with things that make them uncomfortable and also feeling more comfortable about responding in an effective way. That really hasn't been much of an issue until now. In the past, it was students who were almost invariably the advocates for free speech and demanding that they be allowed to say what they think in situations where universities were less comfortable with them saying what they thought. And now it's kind of surprising to have young students basically taking the other position. And so I think universities are learning how to do this. I think this is not something they've really thought much about because it hasn't been a problem until the last couple of years.
How much do you think that sort of demand for censorship or something close to it comes from students who have been sheltered versus how much of it comes from an increasing sensitivity to diversity on campus?
I think it's both. I think a number of factors have fed into this. Part of it is, I think, that there is a group of students, I don't know any idea what percentage it is, but there's a group of students of this generation who do seem to be themselves less comfortable with conflict and with feeling threatened, I mean intellectually threatened rather than physically threatened. But beyond that, I think that there is a greater willingness of minority students to speak out about whatever discomfort they feel than they did in the past, which is a healthy thing. I think that's a good thing. I think the demand for censorship is the wrong solution, but I think that creating an awareness of the special challenges that they face is really important. And I think that's a terrific thing. And to the extent that this generation of minority students, partly because there are more of them, are feeling more comfortable about expressing the ways in which they don't feel valued or they do feel marginalized, I think it's important for universities to hear that and for fellow students to hear that and to learn how to help to deal with that. The other thing that I think has had a significant impact on all this, although I'm not quite sure I understand exactly the dynamic and so on, is social media. Most students at a place like this in the past grew up in a culture in which they almost never encountered really ugly and hateful speech. The mass media never carried it in any way, shape, or form. You might hear it in a locker room or as a joke or in a snide comment about somebody, but it was pretty rare. And now with social media, it's much more pervasive. And I think that has raised the consciousness of people about how much ugliness there is out there. And I think it's unfortunate that it's there. It's good that people are having now to think about who are we as a society and how do we respond to this. But in the end, I think that the way to learn how to respond to it is, because you're not going to be able to censor social media, is to learn how to deal with that ugliness and how to condemn it and condemn it effectively.
What you're saying makes me think back to when I was in college, and I was in college from 2002 to 2006. So Facebook was invented literally halfway through my time in college. And what I think, though, is that in college we were exposed to hateful speech through old media, and probably not to the same degree as on social media. But I remember specifically that the conservative newspaper at Cornell, which has since become less antagonistic, ran a cover where there was an African-American student, or maybe just an African-American pictured, had a large picture on the cover, and then the headline was unqualified. And it was an article about affirmative action. That raised, obviously, a lot of rancor. There were, I believe, marches and postering and letters to the newspapers. And I wonder, from your viewpoint, if that's really exactly what you want to see when that sort of thing happens, that the administration, does not, that there are no consequences from the administration for the newspaper, but that the students generate the opposition.
Yes. I think in a situation like that, I think that's appropriate. But I also think, one of the dangers of, and this is a good example of it, one of the dangers of this way of responding to speech one doesn't like is it makes it impossible to talk about issues. And partly because of the demand for people not saying things that are upsetting, partly because, again, of social media, because it used to be the case that you could have a conversation with a group of people and you could take provocative positions and test them out and challenge people to explain why that's wrong, whether you believed it or not. And you might annoy some people in the context of that conversation, but then it disappeared. And you had the benefit of the conversation, and that was the end of it. But with social media, people now run to Facebook and whatever and immediately say such and such is a racist pig. Can you believe what this person said? And that, I think, has had a really bad effect on the willingness of people to say things that are controversial and provocative, whether offensive in that way or any other way. And I think that dampens the discourse. And I think faculty members as well as students feel this, because who needs the aggravation? And I think that's a bad thing. Because, you or I don't get to decide which things get censored. And if you take your Cornell example, right, the question of, whether affirmative action is beneficial to its beneficiaries or not is actually a complicated sociological question about which serious scholars have attempted to get a handle on. And it's now become something nobody can talk about. And I think that's unfortunate. And there are real issues there. And yet it's now impossible for anyone to talk about it in a serious way.
Now, when you say talk about it in a serious way, are you talking about, say, a media conversation or personal conversations?
Pretty much both at this point, I would guess. For someone to say, what is affirmative action? Right? Is affirmative action, they ask, admitting students who are not as qualified on objective criteria as the other students who were admitted because of a desire for diversity? If it is that, and nobody wants to even answer that question, but if it is that, then is this beneficial or harmful to students? If you had a kid and you could get that kid into the University of Chicago Law School, but that kid's credentials were pretty marginal, you might have second thoughts about whether that was a good or bad idea. And so these are real questions that I think, we should be able to talk about. The problem, of course, is talking about them inflicts harm by its very nature, because it suggests a truth, which may or may not be true, and it has the effect of stigmatizing and thereby hurting certain students and marginalizing them and causing resentment towards them. But the reality is there are also important questions about what is the reality of affirmative action. Does it benefit? Does it not benefit? How do you think about that? Right? As a lawyer, as a law student, that's something you want to be able to understand. And yet it's become very hard to have those conversations.
So that brings to mind another question, which we're drifting away from the topic of safe spaces and trigger warnings, but I think this is just a really great and interesting topic to be on. I wonder if you would categorize Larry Summers' speech about how women may just naturally be wired to be less competent in certain areas. That's in the same vein of something that should be within the realm of acceptable discourse, but can also be harmful to people.
Well, he said that in his role as president of Harvard University. And when you asked me about what are the circumstances in which speech can be restricted, I said one of them is when the speech is incompatible with the core functioning of the university. And a president of the university has a set of responsibilities different from a faculty member. He has to raise money. He has to represent the institution with all sorts of other groups and individuals and organizations and government. And a dean of a law school or a president of a university has a responsibility in that context to avoid saying things that will make it harder for him and for the university to be successful. So I think Summers' comments in that respect, given his role, were unwise. And I also think he was wrong, but I think they were unwise and inappropriate given the specific role. If he were a faculty member speaking as an academic and raising a question, I would think that was perfectly fair game. Whether I agreed with it or not doesn't matter. I think it's perfectly fair game.
So tying that back into the letter that students received this year, one of the theories about it is that this was an effort to appeal to a certain alumni population.
No, that's just nonsense. This was a letter written by the dean of students in the college, who, with all respect, is not an important official in the university. It was basically done both to welcome the new students by giving them a sense of the university's special commitment to freedom of expression, and to justify sending them a copy of Dean Boyer's piece. And it did not, in fact, reflect any substantially higher up understanding of what it was going to say or approval of it. My own view of it, I've never talked to Ellison about it, and I've never talked to John Boyer about it, but my own view of it is that Ellison didn't really understand the implications of what he was saying.
Do you think that it's had any practical effect on campus since it was sent?
It's caused a lot of discussion, certainly. I don't think I'm not aware that it's affected anything of any consequence, other than the fact that it's generated lots of unnecessary discussion. There's lots of important things to talk about. I actually think that the issues of trigger warnings and safe spaces, as if there was a university policy on them, is just off on the wrong track. There is no university policy. Either way.
Yeah, I think that that kind of covers all the questions that I have and all the topics. So I really want to thank you for your time and for your candor.
My pleasure.
All right.
Candor is what it's about.
So what do you think safe spaces are?
I think they're a place that you can go where you your values won't be questioned and your religions and beliefs won't be really questioned. Yeah, I mean, also I think it's a place where a lot of controversial topics don't come up, and opinions aren't really shared on controversial topics.
Okay. Do you think safe spaces are necessary?
I think it depends on the situation. I think a lot of the time safe spaces prohibit a lot of conversation from going on that could be really helpful and insightful. But to some certain extent, if I think there should be somewhere that you can go where you won't be constantly attacked or questioned about something that maybe you don't want to talk about.
So do you think safe spaces should be offered to everyone or just certain groups? Or
I think if they're offered, it should be to everyone, because everybody has something that they don't want to talk about, I guess, or everyone deserves it, I guess.
And what do you think of trigger warnings? Do you think they're necessary in class or in academic settings?
Again, I'd say I think it depends on the circumstance. If you're reading a really for the most part, my teachers have told me if I'm about to read a chapter about rape, because people who have history with that might trigger something.
Yeah.
And so I think that maybe just a teacher saying, hey, this is what it's about is enough, because reading something kind of unexpected can kind of put people aback a little bit.
Okay. And what do you think of the fact that the university did send out a letter saying that there are no safe spaces?